Vamos a empezar ya con este workshop que vamos a hacer por la tarde y bueno, el workshop va a ser en inglés, entonces voy a hacer una breve presentación en español y después ya presento a nuestros ponentes también en inglés. Va a tratar sobre la economía de los datos, sobre las posibilidades que los datos nos ofrecen, sobre qué nos dicen. No sé si habéis estado esta mañana en la charla que hemos estado dando. Yo soy Marcelo Click Soria y ya me he quedado con ese nombre de por vida y en fin, no pasa nada. Entonces, vamos a ver cómo casi todo lo que hemos contado esta mañana tiene relación con lo que vamos a ver ahora y, de hecho, los ponentes que tenemos son de primera categoría internacional. Hemos trabajado con todos ellos y todos han contribuido a lo que hemos visto esta mañana. Entonces, vamos a empezar con Assaf Biderman, que es el codirector del Senseable City Lab en el MIT en Boston. Él nos va a hablar de, no sé, una perspectiva muy nueva. Ellos siempre son capaces de ofrecer una visión muy diferente de lo que se puede hacer en general con prácticamente todo. Entonces, hoy nos van a enseñar cómo con los datos que existen podemos tener una perspectiva muy diferente y qué otro tipo de datos podemos recoger también para inventarnos algo muy nuevo. Después va a hablar Fabien Girardin, que es socio en Near Future Lab. Con ellos también hemos estado trabajando y él nos va a enseñar, nos va a hablar del poder del bocetado para generar cosas nuevas, para innovar, para pensar en general. Y vamos a cerrar con Margolis, quien es socio también en Claro Partners. Ellos han hecho una investigación muy interesante sobre personal data en el mundo, sobre qué hacer con los datos personales, cómo la gente se relaciona con sus datos personales, qué entienden que son datos personales. Assaf Biderman, speaking first, who is the co-head of the Senseable City Lab at the MIT. And, well, I think it's actually better not to go through this all over again and let the speakers take the floor. And, well, you'll see that they're really interesting guys. So, with us, Assaf Biderman, please, a big hand for him.
Thank you, Marcelo. Hi, everybody. So I'll talk a little bit about what brings us to do what we do, something about our motivation, and then give some examples from recent projects, stuff we've been doing over the past, say, 2-3 years, and specifically focus a little bit on some of the work that we've been doing with BBVA recently, exploring things that are closer to us here in Spain. So first about what we do. We focus on cities. Why cities? These are just 4 numbers out of many that show a little bit why they're interesting. Cities cover 2% of the Earth's inhabitable crust, and more than 50% of us live in cities today. So more than 50% of the planet's population has been living in cities since 2008. The number is growing big time. 75% of energy globally is consumed in cities or in the infrastructure that services cities. And in turn, 80% of CO2 or CO2 equivalent emissions take place in cities and infrastructures that service them. So if we think about this, the problems or the challenges, opportunities that the planet is facing somehow merge with those that cities face. So if we can do something about what's going on in cities, if we can tackle some of the major challenges they face, it's a big deal for the planet as well. So that's part of why cities have gone on the global agenda over the past, say, 2-3 years. Another thing is happening in parallel. That technology is taking a bigger and bigger part of our lives. Most of us here have quite powerful computers in our pockets. People can talk to people almost anywhere on this planet. This crosses socioeconomic boundaries. This is an example of a machine-to-machine modem. You can slap one of those on your robot or on your machine, and it goes on the cloud. So machines can talk to machines, and people can talk to machines, and people can talk to people. Things become interconnected. As an example I like to use by Ericsson, it's a prediction they made that by 2020 we'll have 50 billion devices online. So think about this. We have, about 1.2 billion servers on the internet today, 7 billion people on the planet. This is an order of magnitude up. So it means that these devices, these new connected devices, are probably not going to go into our pockets. They're going to go into our valuables, into our cars, into buildings, into infrastructure, basically integrating themselves into our physical environment. So if you think about this, there's almost like a digital layer that's weaving itself into our physical environment. You can flip it on its head and start to think of the city as if it were a computer in the open air. And if that's a new condition we're facing, then there are many interesting questions that arise. How can we program the city to become a better place to live in, more pleasurable, more efficient, safer? Who should program that city? All these questions have been attracting more and more people to deal with this new topic. It doesn't yet have a name. Some people call it urban computing, smart cities, networked urbanism. Whatever the name would be, it's a new field that combines quite a few disciplines, from design, city planning, all the way to computer engineering, software, hardware. A lot of social sciences are required as well, because you need to understand people, not only cities, if you're looking at the intersection between people, cities, and technology. So that's sort of broad background on what the Senseable City Lab looks at. We're exploring this through partnerships with different cities around the world. So we have partnerships in cities in 4 continents today, and companies. All of these found our research through a consortium that we run at MIT. BBVA is one of our partners. We have quite a few more, from the big telcos to the big infrastructure companies, some people from the car manufacturing world, the UN, World Banks, and the like. I'll give a few examples of projects that we've done recently, and I just want to put it in one framework. Borrowing from the idea of controlled feedback loops, sort of the standard loop of sensing and actuation. So if you look at machines over the past 150 years, most of them are controlled through these mechanisms that employ sensors. Could we reduce some of the feedback, please? This is the sound is a bit... Thank you. So you put sensors in a machine. You could analyze the data that the sensors collect, and then in turn you could feed back the results of your analysis so that you actuate the machine so that it functions in a more efficient way, in a better way, in an appropriate way to a situation in real time. Now try to apply that idea to the city. Right? If you can listen to everything, if everything talks to you, if your infrastructure is online, if people are online, if vehicles are online, if objects are communicating, you can actually know their state in real time, you can analyze the information that comes out of them, and then you can feed it back into your infrastructure to try to make things move in a more synchronous way. So keep that in mind. I'll give some examples about what we do with sensing and data analysis, and maybe one example about actuation so that we see the full gamut. So one of the projects was focusing on garbage. This is something we've done in Seattle. This was a partnership with Qualcomm. They build cell phone technology and waste management. They're the biggest waste collector on the planet. And Sprint, who do cell service connectivity. The question we're asking is, where does waste actually go? We're motivated by looking a little bit into supply chains. This is a map that was done by a colleague of ours, Leo Bonanni at the Media Lab. He took apart a machine just like mine and scanned the parts inside. With very little web lookup, he came up with this map. Now look how complex it is. How many countries needed to come together, making different parts, assembly, building inventory, shipping. All that synchronizes in order to bring this machine to MIT. Very complex, mainly enabled over the past 3 decades due to digitization of supply chains. Now, when you throw something away, you have some sort of a belief it's taken care of, all right, but we know that sometimes things don't reach the right location. Mainly, the main problem is that there's no clarity about where things go, so that it's very hard to predict where things go once you put them in a certain bin. So to look into that, we developed a little thing, that sensor on the left. Basically, you charge it once, and for 1 year, it will tell you anywhere on the planet where it is. And later we developed another version of this with Qualcomm. Then we invited 500 households in Seattle to collect trash, and we went to their homes and stapled these things to their trash and told them to throw it away. This is a video that describes a little bit of the project. So anywhere in the world, these things will tell you where they are once once they start beaming back to us. So these are some examples of the things we tagged. Anything from a rotten banana to a fridge. And then people threw it away. These are their traces. So 3,000 items in total. This is a Seattle metro area. So this is the day things were thrown away. You can see them moving around the city metro. 2 landfills in Oregon. Vancouver above, it's where things left to Asia from. This is the scale of the US. The things that travel farther are mostly electronic waste. And the interesting thing is really that it turns out that stuff that we've learned to recycle over the past 2-3 decades, like plastics, metals, glass, paper, really reached its final destination very close to where it was collected in the vicinity of Seattle 2-3 days after it was thrown away. But things that we're just learning how to deal with, like the residues of digital stuff, seem to be going quite far before they reach a final destination. And the other interesting thing that I found in this is, in many of these links, you see almost 12 different subcontractors. So if you look at some of those traces, say, of cell phones were going to Florida, and printer cartridges were going to Southern California, sometimes via Chicago. There were so many links in those traces, so many contractors that subcontracted other contractors, that nobody had a macro view of how this link actually behaves. Where do things actually end up? How long does it take? How much transport is involved? What are the means of transport that these things use in order to get from place to place? So this is a simple example of how, minimal digitization can actually highlight some invisible processes and help us understand some of the infrastructure that services our cities in a better way. There's an obvious turning point where the damage due to emissions from transport outdo the advantages of recycling. If some of those things traveled up to 6,000 kilometers. This is an example of looking at large networks as if they were sensors. In the project before, we were instrumenting our environment ourselves. Here we partnered with a telecom service operator, this is AT&T, in order to see if we can sort of piggyback on almost you can call it the digital exhaust that comes out of the network, data that they use for the purpose of managing their own network, reappropriating it in order to study something about a city, New York in this case. So what we got from them was data about outgoing calls and incoming calls for the whole city. And the intention was to see how does the city connect to the rest of the world. So New York is a global city. It has a lot of connections around the world for commerce, due to immigration also, people keeping in touch with their relatives once they've moved there, or once they've moved away from there. What we were hoping to see is giving calling patterns. We were hoping to see a little bit detail about the dynamics of communications between different areas in New York and the rest of the planet. So for each of these areas, you see these squares here, they're about 1.5 kilometers by 1.5 kilometers. We got about 700,000 calls a week to 180-something countries around the planet, incoming and outgoing. And then we just mapped it. So you'll see this, this is an example. On the top right, it's Flushing in Queens. I don't know how many of you have been there. Maybe stop it for a sec. So again, this list here was 180-something countries long list. We truncated it to the top 20. It used to be the biggest Koreatown in New York, and now it's becoming a Chinatown. So Chinese people are moving there, and you can see it in the data. There's Seoul up here on the top. You see Beijing and Shanghai really climbing up there. And one of our students, Francisca Rojas, did her PhD thesis on this. She went there, she interviewed people, she compared the data with the census, really to try to ground truth and validate the ability of this data to tell us something about demographic composition. Turns out to work, and if you think about this, it could be interesting, especially for developing countries, places that don't necessarily have money for census, places that sometimes grow faster than we have capacity to analyze questionnaires. Think about the big cities in Asia. Nairobi has never had a master plan. right? Or Buenos Aires hasn't done a transportation planning survey in about 30 years. This comes almost for free, right? That data flows through these networks. It's almost like garbage. You can grab it and reappropriate it for the purpose of understanding cities. It's almost like the cell phone network, in that case, becomes a nervous system of the place that tells us a lot about what's going on there, how people relate to their physical environment and to each other. In the case of New York, the only growth that they've seen in the past decade is due to immigration, and a lot of it goes unregistered. So this kind of real-time census can also help in developed countries as well. This is something that we're doing now in Singapore. So think of a lot of this data that emerges from stuff. If you wanted to go and put a temperature sensor in your backyard, we want you to be able to connect it to some sort of a platform, something like an urban operating system. A distributed network would allow you to actually connect a pipe of data and make it available to third-party applications. What about the cell phone network? If they want to connect their data, make it available, they should be able as well. Today it's complex. You have to write a lot of code. There's no standard for doing this kind of thing. Basically, you want to have a push-enabled platform that allows you to expose these type of data pipes to third-party applications and combine different types of data, feeding them back into a physical network. So we're partnered with the sort of parallel of NSF in Singapore. Our part of the project is called Live Singapore. It's part of the bigger project that they sponsor at MIT called Future Mobility. The focus is on mobility, but we're really looking at programming that that platform. And for the purpose of studying this, we partnered with 12 large data providers over there. The port, the airport, 12,000 taxis being tracked. This is all the freight coming and going from in and out of Singapore. Sensors under the ground that tell us how cars move. Local weather monitoring stations. And the purpose is really to show people that there is first value in connecting different types of data for the purpose of creating applications for managing that place in real time. And along the way, we're working on the development of that platform that I just mentioned to you. The project is in its first year out of 5, so there's quite a lot to come. So now I'll talk briefly about what we're doing with BBVA. Marcelo showed earlier a video that this is a screenshot of. So I'll show some other stuff, but just in general first, BBVA is the second biggest bank in this country. We've partnered with them to understand how can the bank start to play a role in helping to service urban environments. How can the data that flows through a bank, how can the capacity that a bank has to manage transactions help in actually creating these information feedback loops that we find so interesting for improving life in urban environments. So we are at the beginning of a 3-year collaboration. We're at the end of year 1 right now. And we're exploring all sorts of data that emerges from the network. We take aggregated data from the BBVA network and use that to study different conditions in Spain. So the first things we looked at were quite simple statistics like distances from where people live and where they spend in different categories. For example, here, sorry, it's a bit cut off. We're looking at groceries, and this is all the people and all the different grocery stores, colored in green, and this is a map of the distance and orientation from a location of the average customer. This is aggregated on all customers, and the question here we're asking is, how far is a type of business from the home residence of a certain customer? And you can imagine that grocery stores, for example, would be rather close because anybody needs to eat. So if you want to go, you wouldn't travel to the other side of the city in order to get food. And you're not particularly loyal to one bread shop versus another, right? Bread is bread. And we were wondering what are the sort of underlying details behind this. So we're comparing groceries to transport and rental shops to gas stations. And you can see the different patterns in there in how they are distributed through the city, which actually makes a lot of sense. Some things tend to be closer to people's homes. Other things tend to be distributed uniformly over the city, and there's no loyalty in terms of how we use them. Some things are actually very particular, and you need to travel to a special place, the IKEAs of the world. And all of this is shown in the data. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but these plots kind of tell that story briefly. Here we created networks of connections between businesses. So we basically created a network saying if a certain group of customers buy in that business and in another business, then these two businesses are connected. So this is a network of businesses, and we're looking at how, for example, gas stations are connected. So turns out nobody's particularly loyal to a gas station, right? You can see that because all of them are connected to almost all of them. And it makes sense. If you need gas, you just stop at the nearest gas station and you get gas. If you look at fashion stores, then the trend is a little bit different. There's really a particular trajectory. People who buy in one fashion store also buy in specific other fashion stores. They won't buy in any other fashion store, right? So that makes sense as well. Look at supermarkets on the other hand. There's great cross-linkage over there. The ubiquity of products, the similarity in products that they sell probably suggests that people are willing to switch between stores if they can find similar products, and that shows in the data. Again, I'm not going into detail, I'm telling this very briefly. You can imagine that there's quite a lot to uncover in this. So here, this is some of our recent work. This hasn't been shown. Don't blog this, please. Here we're looking a little bit deeper into the data, and we're asking, how does money flow through this country? So this is aggregated on the zip code level, and we're looking at money output versus money input. So imagine you can see from every zip code, you can see how much money is coming out. On the other hand, for the same zip code, you can look at all the businesses there and ask how much money is coming in. And then you take the net difference between the two. So it's like you can call it the current account balance of a certain zip code. And then we plotted it. So this is going from a negative current account balance to a positive one. And you can see that there's no clear trend, right? You can see that let's say in the Madrid area, there's both, there are areas that are sort of taking in more money, and there are areas that are giving out more money. You would expect usually that the places where people live would be the places where money comes out of, and the places where the commercial centers are the places where money comes into. And this is what we're looking into right now, but it's interesting that there is quite diversity within urban regions, probably because of the mixed land use that is in them, right? People live and work and consume in relatively the same geographic area, which gives rise to quite a complicated pattern. Here we partition that network. So take that network of money flow. You can perform what's called modularity analysis on this. This is an operation in network analysis, which basically gives you communities. And we're asking something that was very fundamental. If you take that network of where money comes out of and where does it end up, and partition it into communities, we're asking, are these communities continuous in the physical environment? Do you spend money next to your home, or do you have to go very far to spend money? And look what came out. I think it's quite interesting. Not only are they continuous in space, and these are the tightest communities, right? Clearly people travel and they spend money on the other side of the country. But if you look at the tightest communities, those places where people spend most of their money, it resembles a lot the state areas within the country, right? Which shows you a little bit about how this country is structured from a cultural and societal standpoint. And if you take data and aggregate it on the NUTS 3 level, then it turns out that almost all the boundaries between the communities that arise from modularity analysis fall on the NUTS 2 boundaries. Almost all of them. So again, that shows you that boundaries between communities from a social standpoint also reflect themselves in how people spend money. The other thing we studied was some scaling behaviors. So there have been theories that say that the way we has to do in some way with the size of a city. And that gives rise to all sorts of phenomena. For example, some studies by Jeffrey West have shown that the bigger the city is, the more creative stuff happens there. The more patents there are, the more creative industries are housed in that space. One reason for this possibly is because of the greater choice we have to interact with people in a city. So if you have, say, in your lifetime 20 friends, if you live in a city of 20 people, you have very little choice about who these 20 people would be. If you go to a city with several million people, you can choose very, very carefully those 20 friends so that they would fertilize you in an optimal way. So the bigger the city is, there's a superlinear scaling with creativity. We're asking, is there a similar phenomenon when it comes to financial activity? Turns out there is. So actually we got very similar exponents to the ones that have been shown in previous studies. This is a brand new study that we've done, but you can see this is the number of transactions that happen and a correlation with city size. So we took the large urban zones in Spain and we plotted number of transactions in each of them, aggregated for the whole large urban zone versus the population in that large urban zone. And if you look at the exponent, this is log-log scale. The exponent for that line is exactly almost as the ones that have been found in other studies of, say, the superlinear scaling of creativity and productivity. So we find that interesting. This is the beginning of a study, but that might tell us something a little bit more in detail about the underlying principles behind these superlinear scaling phenomena. The last thing I want to talk about is mobility. So if you look at this aggregated data, you can also extract something about mobility. So we're looking at zip code levels or NUTS 3, NUTS 2 sizes in terms of geographic areas. In this analysis, we're asking, okay, take an area where people live and again observe where they spend their money. Measure that distance, okay? That's a measure for mobility. And our question here was, can you re-identify how people have been defining urban zones? So today, for example, in urban studies, in many ways, you look at urban zones based on transportation. So a daily commute, if somebody lives in a certain place and every day commutes to a center of a city, then you consider where he or she lives part of that city, right? In the past, it used to be defined by political boundaries, but we realized that many people would sort of connect themselves to a city just by owning a car or jumping on a train and going to work every day in a city center. So we were asking, can we create a similar definition to large urban zones, looking at where people spend their money versus where they live, again, on an aggregated level. So this is the map on the left. It corresponds quite well to the large urban zones in Spain. You'll see that Barcelona is rather underrepresented here. Now, on the right, we put a threshold of 10 kilometers, and we're asking, okay, how far do people move in order to spend money within 10 kilometers range? So we wanted to see, around your home, how far do you move? And our prediction was that within cities, people move much less, right? You have almost everything you need here within half a kilometer, right? Why would you need to go far? So we were looking at this, and look at this, it really, urban density really emerges. In terms of population density is here and here and here and here. It all makes sense. So in cities, it turns out that people move less. The red color represents low mobility. The green represents high mobility. You really see it in the data. This is, for comparison, a map of business density. So you see that business density and mobility density correspond to one another, which could tell us a lot of interesting things about how to design our cities, how to decide how to zone different places, how to design transportation to service those places, connecting people between their home and where they spend their money. I'll finish here because Fabien has a train to catch today. So thanks a lot, everybody.
We're going to do the Q&A after the three talks. So any questions that you might have, please note it down, and then we will have some time to answer them later. Thank you. No introduction.
Thank you. And thanks, Assaf, for being so kind and making it short. This is Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a strategist. He was a decision maker, an innovator, and a world changer for good and bad. And so Napoleon is famous for many things, and one of the quotes that stayed and still stays among us is in French, "Un bon croquis vaut mieux qu'un long discours." And if your French is a bit rusty, in English the version is "A good sketch is better than a long speech." I guess that in Spanish it's "Un esbozo bueno es mejor que un discurso largo." Algo así. So I'll make a 20-minute speech about why sketching is good and why it's necessary now in the economy of data. And I'll show you some of the work that we do around this idea of sketching with data. So I'm Fabien Girardin. I'm a partner at the Near Future Laboratory. I'm one of the offspring of the Senseable City Lab. I worked there 4 years ago. And I think many people who worked there now have their own kind of research agency or institution that work in similar areas than the Senseable City Lab. And I will show you something that is a bit different from what the Senseable City Lab does, but it's really the inspiration comes from there. So we've been active from a very long time with what we call the data deluge, the large amount of data that are now produced around us and that Assaf showed us. And we've particularly investigated what we like to call network data. It's all the kind of data that we produce through interaction with infrastructure and urban infrastructures and networked urban infrastructure. So every time that you use your mobile phone, you leave a trace. You use, as we've seen, your credit card, you leave a trace of your activity, bike sharing systems, on social networks, and so on. And we pretty much work on all this kind of data all throughout these years. So we do three main kind of activities around this data. First, we worked with organizations to help them locate untapped resources, find out what new can emerge from this kind of data. This is one example of what we did in Geneva in collaboration with our friends of Interactive Things, the city of Geneva, and the LIFT conference. It was just it was an urban demo that showed the activity and the mobility of the city throughout a week during a specific weeks. Very much in line with what Assaf has been showing us. But what we also like to do is to say, okay, those are the data, this is what we have, think about what are the opportunities, and then trying to refine that data and transform it into information. This is one example of our work in taking georeference photos that people upload in Flickr, analyze them, and come up with some sort of photogenic index of each street of cities. This is one example of Berlin, through which the darker green that you see is the more photos have been taken by photographers that come from outside the city. And these kind of new layers of information then are starting to get embedded into our lives and sometimes get embedded, for instance, here into layers of information providers for navigation systems. So we try to materialize this data into new services. And this is kind of work also that we do with BBVA. So how do we make that happen? What's the process? And I guess it's similar with my experience in Boston. The process is quite standard. It's nothing new. In business intelligence, for instance, it's something that is quite traditional. First, you need to collect data, access them. Here, there's a specificity of one of the processes. When you collect the data, then you need to apply some techniques of privacy and data obfuscation. Of course, you need to handle and have tools to do big data management, data mining, modeling, statistics, and this kind of information then are fed into information visualization so that you can share your kind of result with a last part to analysts and planners, for instance, for them to build indicators or to show evidences from your data. So throughout this process, we get to work with a lot of variety of people and a variety of practices as well. Normally, we start with decision makers. They are the one pushing for a specific project. But then along this path, we work with telecom engineers, information architects, software engineers, physicists who have a great knowledge and a long experience of working with a large amount of data, statisticians, of course, designers when it comes to create beautiful visualizations and to make sense and communicate the sense of the data, and planners and analysts in order to then transform the visualization back into meaning that then decision makers can make sense out of it and can act on them. And what we found out in our practice is that throughout each of these steps, we needed to sketch. We need to show what were the questions that each step could answer and what was the next question that the next step needed to show. Every time we needed to visualize that. Every time we need to show to a statistician, that's where the data are coming from. This is the quality of the data. This is what are the problems in the data they have to work with. Every time you need to sketch something, you need to sketch something in order to pass it along that process. So I'm going to now go a bit deeper about this concept of sketching that is not new in a world of innovation. This is one example of my fellow countryman, Le Corbusier. He was a famous architect, and he used a lot of sketching in his work in architecture. He was using it as a rough version of a creative work. And for him, it was extremely useful to assist into reaching a coherent result. And this is basically what we're trying to do also in our work with data. With Photoshop or with pens and so on, we actually put our jumpsuits on and treat data as a material, and sometimes even as a living material. We manipulate it, we fusion it, and we visualize it. And this is a kind of new type of sketching that is necessary to do in this world. So, what are the values of sketching throughout this process? And I'm going to talk to you about 4 main ones. The first one is, as I mentioned, whenever you collect data, you need to get a first view of what they are. Then, from this view, you'll be able to know if you need to clean them. You'll be able to know what are the problems in your data. So that's the first value of sketching. Another one is, as we've seen, we have to deal with many different kind of practices throughout a project. And the value of sketching is the value of sharing a common language. Whenever you're able to visualize something and you're able to show to network engineers and people from product development in the same company, you need to both of them to understand what the data are and what is the goal of what to do with this data. You need to sketch something. And then, of course, as Le Corbusier, you sketch to explore ideas. You sketch to go wild into building on top of your needs. And the last one that I would like to go a bit deeper into is sketching to qualify the results, especially thinking of quantitative information that we've seen from Assaf that sometimes tell us one part of the story, but not the complete story. So let me take you to one of our projects that we did in the Louvre Museum. The Louvre approached us with one specific problem, and that's the problem we see here. They call it hypercongestion. And hypercongestion happens when there are so many people in one space that the visiting experience for each of the individual decreases. So the museum has some understanding of that, and they observe this phenomenon, but they have no measures to know where does it happen, when does it happen, and how can we then find solution on top of that. So what we did is collaborate with a sensor company who provided sensors to detect the presence of people in key areas of the museum. So we deployed and we did 3 audits of 10 days from which we could start to understand the flow of people, the sequence of visit of these people, the time they stay in each of these key areas. And very, very quickly throughout our project, we sketched a first visualization of this is what the data tell us. After 2 days, we wanted to see what the sensor were collecting. And we wanted to see it in order to share it also with the people who were asking us for solution. And this is extremely ugly comparison to what, of course, Assaf. So we were providing unprecedented result to the people in the Louvre, and quantitative information and empirical information of this kind of movement. So they were grateful about that, but then very quickly they said, okay, good. But then, okay, so what for us? What does this mean? And why does it happen? Because eventually you're able to measure something, but then you need to know why does this happen. So we went back to our workshop, put the jumpsuit on, and pretty quickly came back with the same kind of sketch, a little bit different, that we call a replay tool. A replay tool in order to replay a full day of activity in the Louvre based on the sensor data that we had. And we did that in order to tap into the specific knowledge that is in the Louvre that could provide some answers of why did this phenomenon happen. And we went to the people who are on the field, who have the experience of the field, and they have a lot of knowledge of why things are happening, such as here the surveillance team in the Louvre. And eventually, this sketch was used for them, and for them to explain us what happened that day. Was a door open in order to, because there were too many people, and that's why this phenomenon happened and so on. We were able to contextualize the result from the quantitative analysis with a qualitative view that was crucial whenever you want to take a decision afterwards. So in order to do that, you need tools. And there are not many tools to do sketching with data. Or there are many, but none of them are really made for that. Because particularly you need tools to put power in the hands of people that have the ideas and the knowledge. Once again, going back to the people in the surveillance team, they have the knowledge. And we try to do the same with BBVA. BBVA, they know their business, they know the data, and they know their clients, and they're the one who should know best what to do with the data. It's not necessarily us. So we're trying to push into putting the power in the hands of people that have the ideas and the knowledge. But also sketching is about the freedom and trying to go without limitations and trying to draw things without limitations. One inspiration is Picasso, who decided at some point to go away from the limitation of his paintings or sculptures and then started to sketch with light. Oops. And that provided him the ability to build something that was completely new and go with new ideas. So based on our experience and also this kind of inspiration, we built our own tools for ourselves to work in sketching with data. So we teamed up with friends in Barcelona, the information visualization consulting agency called Bestiario. We had a long experience also working with information. And we worked and we built this tool that is a visual programming environment to gather, shape, and share living data. And living data is what we've seen in Assaf's presentation. So let me put my jumpsuit on and show you how Quadogram works. This is one very basic example of taking sensor network information, it's real-time traffic information, and trying to show the different kind of perspective that one data set can tell you about a city. So Quadogram is made of pre-programmed modules. They're like Lego blocks that you can connect to each other in order to build a data flow. So here what we're going to start to do is load data from this sensor network, once again, real-time traffic information in a city, and import it into the workspace for you to sketch. Here, a very basic table of sensors. It's a matrix of the connectivity from each node in the network, and you can see that as Excel show it to you. But since it's a matrix, eventually it's a network. Cars go through the different nodes at different speeds. So in Quadogram, you can add specific modules that tells you, okay, from this table, build me a network. And this is what we see here. And whenever you change something in the workflow, the change is automatically propagated to your visualization. So you can already start to sketch, explore your data while you're building your solution. But this network is actually a sensor network that is in a city. So you need to be able to map them. And in Quadogram, we have another set of tools that allows you to map this kind of network. And this is just what we do here. And we can see here the propagation of the traffic throughout the city based on this data. And eventually, this data is real-time. It's real-time traffic information. So once again, in Quadogram, there's modules to capture the pulse and ask to the data source to bring each second, for instance here, give me the data of the traffic in the city in real time. And eventually in your solution, you can sketch something that shows you what is happening in real time. And based on this kind of information, you can start to think, okay, what I'm interested in here is to understand the relation between the traffic and the temperature in the city. Once again, in real time, because in Quadogram, you can connect to a data source of temperatures in real time in that kind of city. And whenever you're ready with your sketch, you define the area that you think you want to share with your colleagues and friends or whoever, or your clients, and say, this is what I want to share. I want to make it public for others, and eventually it becomes a URL that you publish online so that people can see your sketch, once again, in real time, showing you your solution. So Quadogram became now a service that not only we use, but also we provide online. So let me sum up with some conclusions that we'd like to bring to this workshop. First of all, strategists, innovators, world changers, they cannot afford a long processes, or in the case of Napoleon, couldn't afford a long speech. There is this need to succeed or fail early. Very early on, you need to know about the quality of your data, what you can do with it, what you cannot do with it. So, and sketching brings this kind of instantaneous understanding. Strategists, innovators, and world changers need to have multiple perspectives on one kind of project, such as Le Corbusier, who was sketching his solutions and sometimes building 3D view or 3D perspective of his work. There is the need of innovators to explore without constraints, such as Picasso, who started to use light to sketch his solutions. You need to sketch to communicate ideas, questions, and findings. And since we are among innovators here, I'm just wondering who are going to be within you the next Michelangelo of the data era. Thank you.
Claro partners. Well, I can already tell this is dangerous. I'm also someone who talks with my hands, so people directly in front of me, watch out if this comes flying out. I apologize in advance. Anyways, we are a user-centered business innovation firm in Barcelona. And what that means is we take a little bit different approach than maybe you heard from Assaf and Fabien. We aren't data statisticians, data technologists. We're a group of anthropologists, business strategists, and design folk. So what I'm going to talk about today is more about the role of personal data in our everyday lives, based on a project we did with BBVA and some of our other clients as well. So I'm calling it the personal data economy, and I think we've already pretty much had a nice introduction to what this is from Assaf and Fabien. Pretty much with all of our social networking, our interconnected devices, we are producing tons and tons of data, more and more data about ourselves. And so every time that we click, search, do any of these things, we create a shadow, or what, as Assaf called it, is the digital exhaust of ourselves. And I think the way that we think about it at Claro is it's not just digital exhaust. It's not something we're just putting out there, but it's actually increasingly an input into things we do. We make decisions based on our data every day. Where are you going to eat? How are you going to get there? When are you going to go? All of these things are now decisions we make directly on our personal data. And so people like the World Economic Forum have talked about personal data as the next oil of a new economy. Made comparisons of it to gold, to money. And it certainly is of incredible value, right? And it's increasingly creating new economies and more money for people. And there's definitely like a gold rush to go and collect all of our bits and bytes. But where I think it's different than something like oil and gold is that it's not interchangeable. My personal data is not of equal value to me as your personal data. In fact, it's of most value directly to me. And so while we know that we're creating a whole bunch of this, I think the value that it's actually going to have in the next economy is still unclear. And what we can look at, however, is a bunch of new services, and I'm going to talk through a few startups who maybe don't quite have clear business model yet, but there are new experimental services, and this kind of range of services is growing, and more people are experimenting with what you can do with data. But I still think it's only very early to say what are the business models that are going to last and what are the consumer experiences that we're going to have built upon our data. But we can think about already some of the new ways in which we're experiencing data. If you think about the old way in which you might have interacted with something like your financial data, your health data, even your list of contacts, we can see how new services are transforming this. You know, you might get a statement from your bank that would tell you, the transactions that you made in the past, how much money you have left in your account. This kind of information is available to you every day online, perhaps. But a new service like Simple, which is a banking interface that's mobile on your phone, is allowing you to do things with your financial data just for you that you could never do before, like track your transactions on a map of the city that you're in so you can actually start to remember places, to set goals for yourself, to split bills with your friends, and to do all kinds of things with your data to learn more about your own financial status than you could before. Or you might have heard of the Jawbone Up or any of these numerous self-tracking devices where, before I would go to my doctor, maybe have my medical record. That's something I could look at maybe once a year. But if I wear a Jawbone Up, I can track what I'm eating, my heart rate, my mood, my activity every day. And the Jawbone can even give me an alert to remind me to be more active. Every 30 minutes, it can send me a little jolt to my wrist to tell me to get up and move around. So I think we're having more and more experiences around our personal data and acting from it in new ways. But most of what I'm going to talk about is sort of a point of view that we have at Claro on how new products and services might be developed for this personal data economy. And I think the big opportunity is kind of a shift in perspective. And this is maybe where I think our presentation might be different than the ones you heard before, but I think there's opportunity if we stop thinking about the data and we start focusing on the people themselves. So it's kind of a shift in thinking, as I said, away from thinking about data as user exhaust, right? Just this thing that's put off by our activities online, and actually focusing on users as data empowered. Right? We are not only the producers of our data, we are more and more the consumers of data. And I think we need to ask the question, what kinds of consumers of data are we? It's thinking beyond the functional capabilities of data. We know that using data can make our lives more efficient. We can optimize certain tasks. Right? We can do things better, quicker, faster. But what is the emotional value of our data? What do we learn about ourselves? Why do people actually care about interacting with their personal data? Maybe shifting from thinking about the market value of this data, right? Or the value in exchange. How do we sell it? what's its monetary value, to thinking about its personal relevance. What can it do for me, and how is it valuable in the way that I use it every day? And so it's kind of a shift from what we might think of as big data to small data. And small data means not just giving control over the data back to people, but thinking about what small subset of this data is useful to people. Okay, this is going to get awkward, pushing back and forth. So what I'm going to walk you through is some insights based on research that we did in 7 different cities. What we did is I went out, we talked to over 30 people about their digital devices, data in their everyday life, whether these were people in the quantified self movement, people that are using their devices to navigate their cities. And we talked to experts in the field, various writers from magazines and different professors. We even ran a workshop at the MIT Media Lab. And we also talked to a bunch of startups in this company, in this economy, people who are making new services, like the folks from Simple or Jawbone and these kinds of companies. And I'm going to show you a set of 10 insights based on 3 themes. Basically, a new class of consumers. I just want to talk a little bit about who are these data-empowered consumers. Talk about what is your life like living with personal data every day? So what I'm calling the personal data experience. And then personal data connections. What does this stuff do for us, actually? Why does it matter? And what I'll do is I'll go through these insights, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to suggest an opportunity or a question we might ask ourselves if we're trying to create products and services for this new economy. So a new class of consumer. So basically, the idea is here that, as I said, rather than thinking about the data as a new asset, we got to think about users, data-empowered consumers as a new class of consumer. One of the women I talked to in this research, her name is Kalia Hamlin, and she's the director of what she's calling the Personal Data Ecosystem Consortium. And it's a group of startups who are trying to create new products and services around personal data. And she has also written for the US government on the topic about track, do not track, and things of this sort. And what she said current questions like track, do not track, or opt-in, opt-out, do not provide user control, or how to provide user control and consent are not relevant. We need a new way to make sense of consumer agency. And there's something really inspiring, I thought, about what she said, that just opting in or opting out, or choosing track, do not track, is a pretty limited set of options for users in thinking about how they want to interact with their data. So I want to talk a little bit about who are these users and how are they, in fact, interacting with their data. And so I have 3 insights about this user. And the first is that they aren't ignorant about the value of their data. Something like the Facebook IPO makes it pretty clear to them that it has monetary value to begin with. But they also realize that through their social networking, through their self-tracking, that there's a lot of value in their data from themselves. Whether they learn about how to eat better, whether they stay connected to people they haven't talked to in a long time, they're very interested in producing more and more data. And they see that that value is not just for them, but for others. We talk to people in patients like me, and they realize by sharing their own health information with others, they could together learn to understand their chronic diseases better. Or even people who are blogging and not even putting their name on their blog because they thought the information was of more value to others than even to themselves. And so I think it's a good question to ask yourself if you're thinking of making products and services around personal data. Seems obvious, but is your value proposition clear? I talked to many people who would say, they would download an app onto their iPhone, and it would say, can I use your location for this application? And they would say, well, I don't even know why this. Why does Skype need to know my application? Or my location. Where someone like Foursquare, it's very clear why you're providing it location data. It's giving you something directly back to you based on the location information you're providing them. And I think people are demanding more and more that that value proposition is clear. Why am I giving you this data and what am I getting back? This new class of consumers that they're not just generating data, but they're authoring it. They're doing things in interested ways. In very aware ways, whether that is creating data to serve their own interests. So, maybe you have a air quality control device in your own house because you're not really interested in air quality in your city. What you're most interested in is it in your living room where your kids are? Or they're creating data as part of their self-branding, right? So we've already heard today about using Twitter or these other tools just to put your image out there to brand yourself. So you're authoring an idea of yourself. It's not just data, which gets to a whole question about what's real and what's fake data. And then lastly, we talked to people in the Pirate Party in Berlin, for example, who are using data to even camouflage who they are. Right? So they're all authoring and they're very self-interested in the kind of data that they're putting out. So again, if you're creating products and services here, I think a good question to ask is, are you allowing users to create data that's relevant to their situation? I think one interesting company here is Green Goose. They've created a sort of package set of accelerometers that you can put on things in your house. Like I can put one on my watering can to track how much I'm watering my plants. I can put one on my dog's leash to see how often I'm walking my dog. So ways in which I can create data that's directly relevant to me. And the third thing here is that people are gaining new agency through data. And if you're not a native speaker of English, that basically means they're able to do new things through personal data. Whether that's being able to lead to self-discovery, right? So people in the quantized self movement talk about data as being a sixth sense. It's as important to them as sight, sound, and taste. By their data, they feel like they're going to understand who they are and all of humanity better. But it's also helping us make decisions. Actually, this is Ian Curry from this company called Local Projects in New York, and he was saying, you know, it's not that people want a good cannoli anymore. They want the best cannoli within 3 blocks. And it's our data that allows us to be able to make decisions like that. And lastly, as I think Assaf talked about better than I can, people are able to interact not just with people differently, but objects in the environment, right? As more and more objects come online, we're now able to query a bus, for example, which is something we could never do before. So I think we have to think about what is the specific new capability you're offering to people. We're seeing a whole bunch of new services like Sonar or Highlight, for example, that are doing things like surfacing information about the people in this room. For example, if you are a friend of a friend on Facebook and we have something in common, these services like Sonar can send me an alert to my iPhone to say, hey, Assaf is in the room. He's interested in data. You're interested in data. Maybe you should go over and talk to him. So the kind of new capabilities that we're gaining now and thinking about what those are rather than just repeating what capabilities we already have. So now I want to talk a little bit, if those are sort of the new class of consumers, I want to talk a little bit about what is their experience with data like. And I think what's driving this theme is basically that we need to see data as fundamental to the experience and not just its output. One of the quotes I have here is inspired by actually a failure in our research project where we wanted to talk to, speaking of smart cities, we wanted to talk to NYC Digital, which is a program in New York to make their government services more accessible to citizens. And we tried every which way to contact these people by talking to urban planners who are very influential in the city, for example, and they couldn't put us in touch with anyone. We even showed up at the office building where they were supposedly housed and they weren't there. And yet we'd been hearing a lot about them, as if this was like the future of smart cities and this was the model that we should follow. And I read an article in Fast Company about one of the problems with NYC Digital, and I'm sharing this quote here, but they said that the problem was that they were holding these big hackathons or these big app contests that left user needs and likely user behavior out of the equation. Instead, beginning with an enormous data dump and asking developers to make something cool on top of it. So I thought this was quite inspiring, right? You can look at data and say, hey, we can do all of these cool things. But maybe we need to start with what are the actual needs of people in New York City, and then say, okay, what data do we have that can help solve that problem? So in our research, we pretty much, this was our approach. We went and talked to people about the role of data in their lives, and we didn't kind of interpret data to say, what does it tell us about human behavior? And one of the things people said the most was that they felt burdened by their personal data. Right? We are surrounded by it every day. And burdened first with the fact that we're always on. Right? This idea that people can always contact us, We're always supposed to instantly respond. You know, when someone texts you or calls you, you have no plausible deniability anymore that you didn't get the message. Another way in which they felt burdened was, you know, they just had too much. And people were creating all kinds of strange strategies to organize their vast amounts of data. Whether it was simple things like people, like we see here, Adachi, this was in Tokyo, he had connected his Foursquare just to his Google Calendar as a simple way of creating a journal for himself. So it's just too much information. You now can track everywhere you've been, everywhere you've talked to, except you don't have a way of accessing that information in a meaningful way. So people were creating workarounds for themselves. But I think the biggest burden for people was not even in the data itself, but was in the social management. Right? Now that I have my work friends, my high school friends, my business colleagues, and everyone else I know on my Facebook page, how do I manage how I'm sharing information with them? And people had all kinds of stories about making mistakes and posting stupid things. So the social burden of all of this data is probably the biggest problem for people right now. So a simple question again, if we are creating products and services here is, you know, are you resolving burdens? Are you creating more burdens for people? You know, having access to data is not always of value to people. Right? Maybe I don't want to know more, but I need to help make it easier. So a company like IFT, If This Then That, is a good example here. It's a very easy way to help you organize all of your personal data. You can use it to set simple tasks, like if the weather says, this is one of them, if the weather forecast says it's going to rain, send me a text to my phone telling me to bring an umbrella. So you can pre-program it to do some things to make your task easier for yourself. The second insight under this personal data experience for people was that data is abundant, but meaning is scarce. It's not that people have a problem getting information about themselves. They have endless opportunities through all of our new technologies and social networking to do that. But they can't really make sense of it. And this was most apparent when we talked to the people in the quantified self movement. I mean, here are people who are obsessed with tracking themselves, and yet they had no way to make meaning of all of the information they had. Their Fitbit couldn't talk to their Nike Plus, couldn't talk to their Jawbone, couldn't talk to anything. And, so they really had a hard time extracting meaning from it. And this guy here, I have Phil, who suffers from diabetes, tracks all of his information about his health, and the only way to understand it is by, he has a pump that collects information every day. But he has to print it out on paper and carry it to the doctor every other month to understand what it means. So it's not very useful to him directly. And so people were really craving some kind of tangibility, some way to understand their data on a real level, an emotional level. And we're seeing some devices like these small tools to just give you one RS feed of one data feed to make it real. So I can put it in my house and look at my Facebook feed, so it's like looking at a clock, to make something intangible more tangible. And lastly, people talk to us how, they do so much online that little of it is actually memorable. One of the examples a woman shared with us in New York was that she could remember every time she deleted a friend on Facebook, but can't remember ever adding one. And it was in part because Facebook asked you when you delete a friend, are you sure? Do you really want to delete that? Are you sure? You have to answer the question 3 times, so you remember it and you almost feel bad about it. But they make it frictionless, right, to add a friend. And then it has no meaning at all for you. You can't even remember who's there. And so I think the question is, then, are you providing a meaningful experience? Or are you just giving people a new way to create data? We talked to Dave Wamsley from Gravity 8, which is a new company based in San Francisco for people in the quantified self movement. And he's providing a platform for them to upload all kinds of information that they might track, from their withing scales, from their Mint accounts, from their mood, to things they track about their relationships, so that they can get a kind of big picture of their overall health. And he has 8 points in which he's measuring well-being. The third insight in this personal data experience is that people are struggling to develop social norms. And I realize I should go a bit faster, in these data-driven interactions. So it's awkward most of the time online. Right? People start to act like they're in high school again. Why did she say that? Should I respond to that? I don't really know what to do. And part of the problem with this is that their personal data is shared with others, right? So I tell my friend I can't meet her, but then on my way home I run into another friend, we go to a bar, he checks me in there on Foursquare, she sees it, her feelings are hurt. You know, it's just you don't have control over this stuff very well. And so we're seeing people struggling to develop new rules. And a good example is Pinterest. They have something they call pin etiquette on their website, which is basically a set of guidelines to make sure that you actually cite people when you take their information, right? Which I think this is something important. How, when you create these products and services, are you supporting the norms around it? Because people don't really know. And I think the most critical thing in this data experience is the necessity to separate your identities. When we're thinking about what's happening in industry, there's kind of a convergence to put everything together, to merge all of your emails on your iPhone, for example. And now every time a piece of spam gets in, you're alerted. And so you ignore your alerts, for example. But why this is really important is I think it's deeply related to an issue of privacy. That's a huge conversation around personal data. But when we talked to people about what privacy meant, they didn't say, oh gosh, I'm really worried that Google has access to my information, or I'm really worried Amazon has access to my information. What they worried about was which of their friends had access to their information. Right? Privacy was about their relationship to different people in their social circles. And so this need to separate your identities to maintain that level of privacy was a huge unmet need. And the last bit here is that people don't aspire to be the average of themselves. Right? I might go on Amazon one day because I'm interested in cooking. I go on another time because I'm also an anthropologist, so I'm looking at some cultural stuff, but I'm also a rock climber, so you're looking at rock climber things. And then Amazon can only average all of those things together to make a very bland recommendation to you. So how do we think about services that can actually talk to your different separate identities? And this is a big thing. So if you're going to create products and services, are you helping people manage those different identities and how? And there's a new startup called GoKit that's doing precisely this. So if you want to follow just your friend on Twitter who's a colleague through design and you want to see what they have to say about design, but you aren't interested at all what they have to say about the football game, you can just subscribe to these different personas of your friends. And I'll go through these last ones very quickly, but these are really about what role data plays more largely in our life. I think the first insight here that people expect companies to use data to deliver a more relevant service. We've heard a lot, I think there's a big conversation right now how people are totally unaware of how their data is used. And we talk a lot about privacy abuses, personal data abuses. But people we talk to were demanding that they get more relevant services back. You know, why is it that my phone company sends me a text on my new iPhone telling me I can get a new iPhone? Doesn't my phone service already know I have this? Right? Or the ads that you get that don't seem to track you at all. You've probably heard about Target and the pregnancy. Maybe you did, but there's this fine line between being relevant and being disturbing. Right? So Target had figured out how to predict when their customers were pregnant, even before they did, and had sent some coupons to a 16-year-old for some diapers, yeah. And then her dad got them and actually went to the store and yelled at them, and it turned out they were right in the end. But the problem was, of course, how they handled it. And so their response was, oh, okay, well, we'll just hide those coupons now inside a bigger flyer. And the future would probably be, how about a little bit more transparency in what you're doing? And of course, being relevant depends on time, place, the mode that you're in, the mood that you're in. So these are all things to consider in trying to deliver a relevant service. And so maybe I will skip some of the opportunities here. But yeah, how can you be more relevant directly to your users? The second insight under these sort of data connections is that people need to understand the context of their data. One of the things that we learned from local projects, he said, Ian Curry said, you know, it might seem counterintuitive in the world of frictionless online interactions when you want people to participate, to put up barriers, but it depends on the kind of information you want. And I think this is something we don't think about in creating online services, that maybe if you make it just a little more difficult, it becomes more memorable, like the deleting of the friend on Facebook. And they have a project called StoryCorps for collecting stories in the US. And they make it hard to participate, and they make a story booth that feels very professional. It's not easy to use, it's a little bit hard to use. But he says, and everyone who participates thinks they're doing something very important. And I think another problem with the context of data is basically that people only judge it in the moment. You download a coupon, you do these things. We don't really have the ability to imagine the long-term life of our data, right? Things, you know, data seems to last forever, but the relevancy and the emotional attachment to that data is very short-term, and that gap causes all kinds of confusion and problem for people. And so I think a key question in developing products and services in the personal data economy is, are you thinking about if you're staying relevant as people's relationship to their data changes over time? I think Path is a really interesting example here. They were the first to create a timeline format for your updates. You know, that's something that's on Facebook now. But you remember, Facebook used to just be this endless scroll of updates, and you didn't really have a way quickly to say when that happened or why it happened. And even just adding this timeline like Path had done, which was like a journal, it made it more important to you, more relevant to you, more understandable, because you had a context to go back to it. And the last point that I want to bring up is sharing. Now, we talk about sharing all the time, but this is a really overused term. We use sharing to describe a whole range of behaviors online. You know, I think the thing is that, like, sharing online is this effortless thing, but it has very little in common with sharing offline. You know, if I want to share an apple with you now, I have to cut that apple in half and give up half of it to you. That's how you share. So where's that tangibility of sharing online? And people were struggling with this, and we're talking about, you know, doing things like, well, sometimes I'll just email someone directly because that feels more meaningful than posting it on their wall. So they're trying to create ways to share more meaningfully, and they don't really have those tools. Another thing we call sharing is often just self-broadcasting. People are just being provocative, right, or just trying to gain a reaction, or they don't even know who they're sharing with, but that we call that sharing too online. And lastly, their motivations are different. Like, sometimes we're sharing to reconnect with people that we already know, and sometimes we're sharing to go and discover something new. And these are also very different. And so I think, again, if you're going to create new products and services here, you have to think about, how is that gesture of sharing meaningful to your users? And we are seeing a whole bunch of new kind of intimate services popping up now. This Is My Jam is one example. It allows you to choose just one song to share with your close group of friends a day. So if you're going to post just one song, you're going to think about that selection more, and then your friends are interested in it because they can only listen to one song that you posted, not your entire Spotify playlist from the day. And there's even another service called Pair, which is a social network just between you and one other person. So I think people are looking for these more intimate, meaningful gestures of sharing of their personal data. So I had a few more things, but I'll just say this is sort of the summary of these insights, and maybe I'll just leave you with this, and it's sort of an inverse of where I think some people start. We sort of have a whole set of tools. I mean, this is getting you to say, you know, do you understand your data-empowered consumer? I think the question of getting data is pretty easy, and these are sort of a series of questions I think companies who want to make new products and services in this economy need to ask themselves. Getting the data? Sure, and there's a whole range of financial, I'm going backwards. You know, relationship data, activity data, self-tracking data. You know, this is becoming more and more of a commodity. But then, you know, really saying, well, who is this data for? And I think a key question is, then how are people going to experience it? You know, if I took it through a sort of set of generic insights, but I think if you're going to create a service around personal data, really understanding what does the moment of access look like? How do people create this data? How do they then make sense of that data? how are they going to manage it over time? And really understanding this full experience is critical to designing services here. And it seems kind of simple in the world of user-centered design to ask these questions, but it's something we often don't ask in the world of data experiences. So maybe I'll just leave it there. Yeah. Yeah, I think I went over. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know if you guys have to go somewhere else, but I think that it would be really interesting to go now for a Q&A session, because I think, well, the three speakers have raised some really interesting issues and some really interesting projects, applications, and so on. So I would invite the three speakers to come over to the stage, and actually we will need to get some chairs as well for them to sit. And don't worry, I got it here. And if you guys have some questions, then we'd be happy to pass the microphone around. So yeah, just a second that they get ready. And actually, Fabien, okay. Can you make it, Fabien, or you have to? Okay, thank you. So yeah, I will.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions for the first speaker. Sorry, I don't remember your name. The first one, it's about this data source. So basically, you presented a wealth of amazing visualizations of data. That's great. But my question is more related to how do you get to that data? And especially the question is related to the fact of open data movements. So you presented some data or visualizations derived from data that it's probably not available to everyone, which is cool. But still, I'd like to size the opportunities from using those kind of results and outputs from open data. And the second question is somehow related to, in your opinion, and could be a quite open question, but anyway, if you had like some of the data that you had like incoming and outgoing calls, what would be the most valuable output you may think you may come up with by mining that data?
Okay, thanks. These are good questions. When I showed stuff here, we had 20 minutes, so I focused really on work that's related, that's under one specific theme, just to tell a coherent story. In our work, we are agnostic to the data. I don't care where it comes from. Sorry. I don't care where it comes from.
I'm sorry I asked that question.
No, I mean, it's really an important point. I don't care where it comes from. I care what we can do with it. So we've explored using user-generated content. Fabien was involved in mining Flickr data, stuff that people put open online. The open data movement is just part of the data that people make available online for everybody to freely use. Okay, it's well blessed. It's still in its infancy. I don't think it should be centralized the way it is. I don't think it should be archival data. We're really moving towards seeing real-time data becoming available, and that's really what you can build apps on as a developer. Think of what we were doing in Singapore. It's the development of this urban operating system, or the set of APIs that you can plug data to and access with software from the top. As a developer, that touches on the point of allowing everything to become an open data movement. Then as a provider, you can decide how much of it do I want to open. My temperature sense. When this stuff starts to happen around you, I think there would be much greater willingness to share data, but also to become a developer of that data, going to the point that she mentioned. At the end of the day, citizens are the ultimate actuators of the city. So I guess I'm trying to tie both your questions together. The fact that we're using some data that is not available to everybody, I hope is momentary. If a cell phone network understands that there's new value to the data that they have been so far keeping in-house, maybe sharing with a few, they might just open it for the general public. Maybe even sell it, maybe share it freely, who knows. But the point is to build value on this so that we can actually see it going elsewhere. I hope to see actually the developer community, us, beginning to write apps that change stuff in the physical environment. Think of what built value on the web, on the internet. The moment where APIs and open SDKs were introduced, it really changed the way the internet looks. We're sort of just before that when it comes to the merger between the web and the city. So once things will be able to, become mashable in the city and we'll be able to write those apps, we'll see a whole bunch of interesting things happening out there.
Okay, thank you.
More questions?
Hi, my question has to do with the specific projects you have presented. All of them are focused mainly on monitoring and analyzing data offline. I mean, it's nice, but don't you have any ongoing project related with real-time monitoring and decision-making? Because, I mean, it's the challenge...
Yeah, no. It's good question. Two of the projects I showed were real-time. The New York project, all the data was analyzed in real time. The census view at it relates more to work we do with archival data. But the Singapore project is strictly about real time. It's about mobility. Singapore faces about 15% increase in population over the next decade and a half. They cannot build more roads. The only way they can get more capacity is by using things smarter. That means real-time management. And real-time management not only in terms of making the light green when the bus comes, but making you, the driver, be able to make the strongest decision as you move around, the smartest one, best informed one. So yeah, real-time is a big focus. Actually, we have a whole lab within our lab that's called the Real-Time City Lab, within Senseable City Lab. So you can even work with user-generated content today to build real-time apps, because so much stuff is being communicated by people about their environment that you can grab enough at any given moment to tell a story about what's going on. Almost borrowing people's eyes and hands to tell a story about their environment. Fabien at our lab, when he was at our lab, worked on a project he called The World's Eyes in Barcelona, grabbing people's Flickr photos and using their photos to tell a story about the environment. You can do that kind of stuff today in real time. So certainly, real time is a big component, and that's why you want that push-enabled web to become a reality as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay.
Hi, I have a question for Abby. It's just related with the data that comes from students, performance of the students, the grades of the students. How do you think that providing this data to others can change the higher education ecosystem? I mean, I am relating this with movements in academia in MIT and Stanford with Coursera, Udacity, and of companies that have appeared in last fall. Do you think, from your point of view, that it can have some impact, that performance of the students belongs to the student and he can take this data and provide it to companies that they value the student independently of where he has studied?
Okay. I mean, I guess I would say it's all depending on what is the benefit to the student. I think is exactly the key question to ask. We know that. I mean, I think it's less a question of ownership. I think for me, around data, I think digital data is impossible to sort of assign who owns it. It becomes a very difficult question. But the thing is why would they want to share? And helping them understand who would have access to it, why they would share it, and what they would get from doing it, I think has endless possibilities, whether it's just to connect them with new people, or is it in a limited set of people, or could they do it, I don't know, with a set of students together, send this information? I mean, I think it could be very, very transformative. But for me, the end question is what is the benefit to the student themselves is the key question to ask. Does that make sense? I'm not sure that answers your question.
Well, Yes, more or less. I'm concerned with problems that I have read in some universities where, because they are not paying the students, the university retains the transcripts. So they can't apply, for example, to other studies in another university, or they can't show they have finished their studies because they haven't paid their.
And so then the university keeps their information. Yeah, wow. Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, this is sort of one of those battlegrounds. Is again, I think it does come to the question of ownership, where it seems like people are trying to establish ownership over data, which I think is in the end a pretty losing battle.
Thank you. So it seems like we've run out of time, is that correct? Okay, then, well, I would just like to thank again our 3 speakers today. I think it's been an awesome workshop, and please give them a big hand because they earned it.